In an interview with ABC Australia's Sarah Ferguson this week, billionaire Bill Gates had this to say about the mainstream media and spreading misinformation. Let's watch.
A virulent conspiracy theory emerged during the pandemic that you were using vaccines, using the vaccine rollout to control people, even to the extent of people claiming you wanted to insert chips inside them. Now, a lot of those ideas were spread by tech companies, by platforms owned by tech companies. Did you ever complain to them about those debates going on unchecked?
Yeah, I mean, I think every time the question's asked, it helps spread the rumor. So, maybe I should complain even more. But I certainly point out false stories when they're published, or even people who highlight sort of almost silly misinformation.
But did you talk to the tech companies about how those debates were being carried out?
Yeah, there's a constant dialogue of anybody who gets, this crazy stuff published, of going to the digital platforms and saying, hey, look at this, look at that.
Ferguson went on to ask Gates about big tech's role in misinformation. Let's watch that.
It's not just the attacks on you. You say more broadly that digital polarization is one of the forces holding back progress, and it's getting worse. So should you be taking a different approach to how information is managed?
Well, every country has different laws and different approaches. I don't have the magic solution to misinformation.
Do you wish that Elon Musk hadn't bought Twitter, for example?
Elon's done a lot of great work. I'm not sure that's the best use of his time, but it's up to him what he decides to do. We have a generation coming that will hopefully be creative about social media and how we make it more of a force for good.
So I think the things he said in those clips were mostly benign. The question asker, the way she phrased that tech companies she said something like tech companies are publishing all this misinformation. The tech companies is the platform. It's
right.
People doing that. Right. So stop going. That's a part of the whole problem is sometimes people in government going to the platform and saying, why are you saying this? It's people on the platform are saying this. It's people saying things. If you have a problem with people saying things, it's a different problem.
And so often, you can't help but miss the dynamic here of one of the richest men on earth saying that he doesn't like that there are these platforms that allow regular people to promulgate their ideas and opinions in a way that before the corporate media wouldn't allow, because there's gatekeeping, because you have to have a certain kind of credentialing to even get on one of those platforms. And I'm not saying that there aren't legitimate concerns about various things being said that are untrue, and et cetera, et cetera. Obviously that gossip and libel and all of that has existed since time immemorial. But I think what has always disturbed the rich and powerful about social media is the democratic nature of it, the essentially democratic nature of it. Journalists are always upset about what's going on Twitter, et cetera, because they feel like they got access to the New York Times or Washington Post or whatever to say what they wanted to say. And they're very angry that some random tweeter with a bunch of zeros behind their, random jumble of numbers behind their name can confront them in these online spaces.
It's democratic and it's decentralized.
Yeah.
The gatekeeping is over.
Yeah.
That's exactly what the issue is. And right, that means more people are saying things, and it's not possible for Bill Gates type people to control them. And that has pluses or negatives. I would argue it has more pluses than it has negatives, because people whose views and perspectives were not well represented by the mainstream media in the past, and that includes people of my ideology and people of your ideology. There are more spaces for communities of libertarians and leftists and Trump supporters and all sorts of dissident outside the narrow view of the New York Times and the Washington Post to have flourished. And some of that included criticism of Bill Gates and his companies and of vaccines and of how they're being required. He'll say, and it's a little bit of a thing to go to the most crazy thing anyone's saying, right? Yeah, that they're putting microchips in people.
Yeah.
Right. Easy to say. That's not true. That makes it sound like everyone who's against vaccines is crazy.
but that you invested in a company that was tied to these vaccines, and you had a narrative about how effective they were at one point, and then after you sold some percentage of your shares, suddenly you seem to have a much more honest take about the limited efficacy of vaccines with respect to transmission. Yeah, yes. I mean, that paints a different kind of picture.
People losing their jobs because they didn't want to get it. People are not allowed into our country because they didn't get it. I mean, it intersects with policy to a great degree, and powerful people were making these policies, and your ability to scrutinize these policies, to question them, is enhanced because of social media the way it is now.
Yeah.
It would be worse with the kinds of controls over social media that people like Bill Gates and political figures in both parties want to have. We would be so much more shut down. Yeah. Those of us who have been critical about aspects of this.
For sure. The one other thing that I'd say is that acknowledging that there is some stuff that's wrong, as much as we have objective truth in this world, or that is hateful or inciting violence against various marginalized groups, things that as a community we might decide we don't like, even if it's legally permitted speech. To the extent that that stuff is out there and people are concerned about how to combat it, I would ask, humbly submit, that maybe we should pay a little bit more attention to our capacity for persuasion. I know that people think persuasion is dead. Politicians just poll and they run on what the poll says. You hear people, particularly on the left, liberals, talking about how, well, the public won't get this. It's not worth explaining it to them. It'll go over their head anyway. They have absolutely no confidence in their ability to make a case, even though they're very smug about being right about stuff. And before we jump to the most authoritarian measure to curb speech that we think is like socially maladaptive, let's say, even if it's not illegal, I would just like to see more of an effort made to engage with folks, persuade folks, and make people see your point of view. Because I think that's a fundamental issue at the core of politics today. That extends far broader in its reach and impact than just the social media conversation.
The the interviewer was asking about other countries and what kind of speech policies they have. And Bill Gates is right to say that, yeah, everyone does not have the exact same speech policies that the U.S. has. It's always worth pointing out, I do it frequently, that Europe, for instance, is more about privacy than about free speech. And in Europe, there are laws to actually force tech companies to take down information about you that you don't want to be out there. That could never happen in the U.S. because the First Amendment wouldn't allow the government to force, except in rare cases.
We have revenge porn laws.
If it's explicit content, if it's underage content, there are cases. But generally speaking, can't just make Google delete a result from you don't like. So those are trade-offs, and it is true that it's different in other countries, and it's worth saying, well, who has arrived at the correct balance between speech and privacy? Because some of these are harder questions than others.
It is tough. We just actually had this conversation on my podcast a couple of weeks ago. We were talking with the head of Intercept Brazil, and he's an American but has lived in Brazil for a long time, and was talking about how you don't have the free speech in the same way. And he's like, well, I'm American with American sensibilities about this, but I also can't ignore the fact that this is a country that had a military coup and leaders until the 80s. There are speech, prohibitions against speech to encourage exactly those kinds of coups. And I understand why they've landed at a different place. And would Americans feel different about this stuff if we had a somewhat more revolutionary history and a less stable political history? Who's to say? But it is interesting to do that kind of comparative law analysis and see there are a lot of places that we consider to be very free that don't have the same kind of absolutist view about free speech that as we do, and whether or not we are happy with the trade-offs that we've made.
Yeah, and to be clear, I'm generally happy with the trade-offs we have made. I don't think I wouldn't want to live in a country, or I might live in the country, but I would be unhappy with the policy of routinely criminalizing people who post rap lyrics online, or even every now and then Germany will throws a 95-year-old woman in jail for saying something Nazi, and it seems totally, to me, unnecessary from the standpoint of preventing the rise of Nazism to put an old woman in jail. But they do that because they have strong laws against. I also doesn't seem to me like criminalizing Nazi speech was criminalized throughout the time period when Nazism rose in Germany. Nazi leaders were jailed. It doesn't seem like that approach actually worked to keep that at bay. So anyway, but given that technology will create new ways for us to share, right, explicit things and privacy, all those kinds of things, there will be a need for some new policies or rules that we'll have to find out if they're consistent with the First Amendment. But I imagine various courts will say, like on revenge porn, there's some debate still. Some courts said, yeah, you can criminalize this. Some said, actually, you can't, which would then be totally dysfunctional. But that's how it goes.
Yeah. Do you think Bill Gates knew not to come for Elon Musk and declined to criticize him directly because he didn't want the backlash on social media?
100%.
Or do you think they're actually friends and in a billionaire club and maybe he genuinely didn't want to attack Elon Musk?
I think he would not have attacked Elon Musk there, even if he really doesn't like Elon Musk. But you're correct in that he might actually not have a problem with Elon Musk, or they might have they might have some entangled business interests we don't know about. They might both be investors in something we're not aware of, right?
When they're in the doomsday bunker on the rocket ship to Mars when the planet is burning, it'll be awkward in close quarters if they've argued, if they've bickered back on Terra.
Back on Terra. I would like to see that movie. We'll have more Rising right after this.